Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I want to just take a minute and introduce our facilitator, Ms. Doria D. Johnson. Doria Johnson is a PhD candidate in U.S. history at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, or Wisconsin-Madison. Her scholarly work has been closely linked to her familiar history. Her great-great-grandfather, Anthony Crawford, was lynched in Abbeville, South Carolina in 1916. Seeking justice, Doria successfully pressed the U.S. Senate to apologize for their slowness to enact federal legislation against lynching. Resolution 39 was passed in June 2005. Ms. Johnson received her master's in Afro-American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and her bachelor's from Roosevelt University in Chicago, Illinois. Ms. Johnson is interested in women and gender, feminist and womanist theory, visual culture, and critical race studies. She has won many fellowships, including the Proctor Conference, Bill Lucy Social Justice Fellowship, the Mellon Fellowship, University of Wisconsin, and the University of Chicago Research Fellowship. And most recently, she has just been named the 2016 Nelson Mandela Fellow. And Yale University Public History Fellow, having recently visited hotbed places activists and residents of Ferguson, Palestine, Chicago, Soweto, South Africa. She has testified around the world about the conditions of African Americans in the United States. Doria is currently a scholar in residence at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference and Shorefront. She has also taught United States history, women's history, humanities, and has lectured globally on the impact and legacies of violence against African Americans, U.S. history, feminist, womanist theory, and is most proud to be a suburban public historian specializing in experiences of Evanston's domestic workers on her grandmother's generation.
Right.
Doria Johnson. Okay, can everyone hear me?
No.
How about now?
No.
Hello?
There.
Yeah, but it needs to be louder. If the oldest person in this audience can hear me, then I'm successful.
I have on my hearing aids.
Can you hear me okay?
I said, but I have on my hearing aids.
Okay. Welcome to our reunion. Can you still hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, great. Welcome to our reunion and to our panel. I'm going to first offer my comments and then I'll introduce each one of our esteemed panelists. We are at a critical time in America. I just powwowed last week with some of the top historians in the United States, and we're thinking that this is at a critical juncture that we're calling a third Reconstruction. The first Reconstruction in America happened after the Civil War, and the second, we're arguing, happened after the Black Freedom Movement or the Civil Rights Movement of the 60s. And what a Reconstruction presents us with is an opportunity to change, right? And so we think that we're at that critical mass now. We are at the intersection of the Black Lives Movement, a largely queer-led movement, which is different for the United States. Queer genesis, let's say that. We are also, looking at a time in America where the Black presidency has percolated new sorts of racism in the United States.
But you know, we also have a backdrop here in Evanston where the rest of the country has de-escalated policies like stop and frisk. But the Evanston Police Department got famous 2 years ago for escalating stop and frisk. We know that's a racist policy. 2 years ago, I was at a city council meeting where statistics were shown that almost more than 90% of police stops in Evanston were black people, but we had less than 2% convictions. That's harassment. So as you traveled here today, I want you to understand that my body is at risk every time I drive in the 5th Ward, because I can be harassed simply because of the color of my skin. And that the Evanston Police Department proudly says that. That's the condition we live in. There's an apartment building down the street where the black residents have signed off in order to get those apartments that their bodies can be taken by the state, because they can be drug tested anytime they want to, anytime somebody wants to, because they have those apartments. That's the Evanston we live in today. So we've talked to black kids in Evanston who have also reported that the police stop them all the time outside of their parents' purview and take their names and addresses. We don't know what happens to that information. You know, when I went to high school and I was in honors classes, I was the only black kid in those classes. So what does that say about integration supposedly in Evanston, but segregated schools on the inside? We have to talk about this. All right, so those are sort of my opening comments, and to help us understand how we're going to move historically from before to the conditions in Evanston now. Our first panelist is Dr. Gilo Kwesi Logan. You guys know Gilo, right? He's a proud father of 2 sons, and a 3rd child due August 10th this year, and a 5th generation native of Evanston, Illinois.
Here.
He's an internationally recognized diversity consultant, educator, and writer. As president of Logan Consulting Services, his mission is to help leaders, organizations, teams, and individuals meet the challenges of working and living in a global society. Dr. Logan has over 20 years of K-16 experience in interdisciplinary education as a member of the National Diversity Council, and serves as adjunct faculty of diversity and social justice in Chicago, Illinois. He founded Soul Creation, which is a wonderful organization. Some of you may be familiar with that. And is a doctor of education with research interest and expertise in racial and ethnic identity development, and has 8 years experience living in 23 countries throughout North and Central America, the Caribbean, South Pacific, Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, and West Africa. Welcome, Dr. Logan.
Thanks.
Oliver Ruff was involved in education formally for 36 years before retirement in 2005. He began his education here at Foster School in kindergarten. He returned to Georgia, where he was born. Upon returning to Evanston after a couple of years, he re-entered Foster School. He had some very passionate and committed teachers who demanded your best efforts. He attended Dewey, Skiles, and UTHS. Upon graduating, received his bachelor's degree in elementary education from Baker University and completed his master's degree at National College. And then did doctoral degree studies at Roosevelt University. Mr. Ruff, as most of us call him with love, has been the assistant principal at Skiles, Oakton, Chute, and Kinlab. As somebody said today, just being a child and looking at Mr. Ruff's face, you felt comfort. So I'm glad to have him here with us today. Today he has his own educational consulting company. So welcome, Mr. Ruff. And now we move to Dr. Neighbors, who is the pastor of Second Baptist Church here in Evanston. Reverend Neighbors earned his undergraduate degree in English and Creative Writing at Western Michigan University, He earned his Master of Divinity and Master of Theology degrees at Princeton Theological Seminary, and completed his Doctor of Ministry degree at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Fellow at the United Theological Center. He was a fellow in Sustaining Pastoral Excellence Program of the Lilly Endowment, and was a fellow in Pastor Theologian Program led by the Institute of Theological Study. Dr. Neighbors has received over 100 community church and ministry awards for leadership and service in New Jersey and Michigan, and before leaving Princeton, the mayor and city council commemorated his leadership by naming October 12th as Dr. Michael Neighbors Day. I met Dr. Neighbors at the United Nations earlier this year, and I was so excited to see his leadership here in Evanston. I was moved by a letter he wrote to the city of Evanston. And I call it the letter from the Evanston jail because it sounded just like the letter from the Birmingham jail of Dr. And so he makes us ask, if integration can't work here, then where? But Dr. Neighbors read a report, a brave report, released by District 65 recently, that really, through transparency, shows the disparities in the kids here in Evanston. And he was moved. So I welcome Dr. Neighbors here for us. Last but not least, Dr. Iva Elaine Carruthers. I can do this without notes. Iva was born in 1945 at Providence Hospital in Chicago, Illinois, and was educated at the Evanston schools. Her mother, Lois Johnson, is here today. Let's welcome Lois. Iva received her bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and then her master's and PhD at a very early age from Northwestern University, and became one of the most sought-after, well-known sociologists in the country and in the world, really. She's one of the architects of what you think of as Black Power. How many of you have heard the Afrocentric term? That was invented in her living room. If there was any leader through the mid-20th century up through now who has been important in intellectual thought, Pan-Africanism, Iva has them in her Rolodex and probably has sat in their studies. Iva has been very important to the notion of reparations movement throughout the United States and the world. She's testified all over the world. We're very lucky to have her here today. Hired as Professor Emeritus from the university, from Northeastern Illinois University, department head there at the Department of Sociology. She also was one of the founders of Inner City Studies on the South Side, which is also part of Northeastern Illinois University. And so since post-retirement, she's done some phenomenal work. She's a phenomenal woman. The Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference is one of the premier institutions in the United States who collects testimony, does social advocacy, and really galvanizes the faith community around the world. It's a United Nations NGO. And they do advocacy for African Americans and really human rights throughout the world. So that is a little bit about my mentor, Iva. Yes. Okay, so we're going to start the panel now. We'll let Iva open up with just a few minutes of commentary about, if not Evanston, what does that mean?
So Doria keeps changing how we're going to do this every time she opens her mouth, but that's okay. That's wonderful. I am really, really pleased and honored to be here. And of course, I could not be here if I were not the child of my mother. And so I do want to celebrate her presence, Lois Johnson, who is 8 years old in August, around the corner. I also must acknowledge my other mother, who is none other than the Honorable Lorraine Morton. My neighbor, and you see that as soon as she came in the room, I got off the stage and went down there and hugged her, because I understand what I must do. And when we left the first panel, Doria, I was reminded that the tension that we're expressing and experiencing has to do with our understanding of our personal experiences in relationship to this question that we in America have been addressing relative to race in America. And the individual self is in tension with the collective reality or the corporate reality. And so it is this tension that my comments, I hope, through both anecdotal, because I will share some of my personal story, but also my analysis as a scholar, hopefully will bring a unique contribution to the task that we've had at hand, and the wonderful opportunity that this moment has brought us all to reflect retrospectively in order to think about the creation of how we move forward and the creation of a different kind of world. And so let me just begin by saying I am fourth generation Evastonian. My great-grandparents came to Evanston, and we were a member of Ebenezer AME Church. When I think about foster school, my mother came to foster school in kindergarten 93 years ago. Her mother, my grandmother, I'm named after my grandmother, Iva, took on the justice issue of foster school, of the teachers deciding that since the future of the children would only be to be domestic servants, that the teachers should bring their clothes and the school should buy washer and dryers for them to learn how to wash, clean, and press the clothes. My grandmother and her peers organized the parents to fight that, and they were able to successfully defeat that proposal. When I was in school, my mother, Ray Morton, and others had to be over the process by which the voice was held to desegregate the 7th and 8th grade classes of foster school, and to take on that whole issue of separate but equal, which was really the backdrop of what became the discussion we're talking about now, which was, quote, from desegregation to integration. And so I give us that backdrop because all of that happened in the context of a collective or a corporate experience in the United States, and part of my research had to do with the institutionalized form of education vis-a-vis people of African descent. And if we were to simply think about that historically, this is what we can say. At first, there was a policy of no education for people of African descent. That was the safest way to manage slaves and the enslaved, and that was the safest way to have, quote, race relations. Then it moved from, well, we ought to give them religious education because through the scriptures we can justify slavery. And so the next phase was religious education. Then when persons like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and Gabriel Prosser and D.M.R. Vesey turned out to be ministers, that clearly said that system didn't work either. And so they then said, the next thing we must do then is to create a divide and conquer. And so we're going to organize a way to educate the children that represent the enslaved rape of black women and white men. And so the mulatto children were selected to be educated and treated differently than the others who had been enslaved. When that system broke down, and it was really out of that system that historical black colleges and universities were born. And there was always a paper test as well as to whether you could get admitted based on the skin texture and color. But then when that system broke down, you morphed into what we came to know as separate but equal. Fast forward to 1954 with all deliberate speed. And that is where I entered the picture. I had incident in this very building that Lorraine Morton knows about. My mother was president of the PTA. Fast forward, a teacher hit me, I hit her back. I got expelled. They gave me a psychological. They said I was too smart to be in the all-Negro school, and so my punishment was to separate me from my class and send me to Haven as a test. So I graduated from Haven and then went to high school. It was during that period that we can go from Emmett Till to the assassination of Medgar Evers to the assassination of Malcolm X, et cetera, and it was in 1968 that after having been away from Evanston for a few years, done undergraduate school, had gotten married, had an 11-month-old son, my husband, who was a graduate of Northwestern, drowned. I became a widow, returned to Evanston, but before I returned to Evanston, I want to put a pin in the widowhood and thank and celebrate Bob Brower and his wife Marcy, who is not here, who took care of our son for 2 weeks as I went through a process of mourning. Because my former husband had worked for Bob and Marcy as a camp counselor while he was in college. Bob, just stand up for personal testimony of what can happen when you break through barriers of race. Our problem is that that does not get translated into dismantling and transforming systems of oppression, racism and white supremacy. So we have to separate out our individual experiences from those which represent the systemic kinds of structures, policies, and beliefs which sustain the kind of issue that we're confronting. And it's with that then that I entered back into the Evanston conversation as a doctoral student and became co-founder of the Black Caucus. As co-founder of the Black Caucus, we engaged in this process of desegregating, quote, the Evanston schools, but not because we saw integration as the end goal, but because we were on a trajectory of having a belief that somehow education was related to one's capacity to end up in a society in which the whole of your humanity was affirmed. And that was indeed the end goal. It was about our humanity. It was not about who we sat next to, but that wherever we sat, we were viewed in the wholeness of what it was to be human. And that we could create community out of an understanding of the diversity of the humanity that we shared with people who were different than we. That was what drove us to stand up and support Greg Coffin's quest to have Evanston be a model for transformative education in the United States as a way to fulfill America's democracy. It was in that context then that we and I was able to research and find out that there was a great disparity between desegregation and integration. And in that journey, what happened was the disempowerment of what had been that which held the Black community together. The church community, the family, the capacity to have those institutions that Bennett Johnson mentioned that affirmed a sense of community, which increasingly with each generation began to disintegrate because of this chase for a notion of, quote, integration, which was never fulfilled. Foster School became an experiment, and that indeed is what it was. It was an experiment. I was the first Rockefeller, I think it was Rockefeller Fellow, that was able to take what was going on at Foster and provide a context for that in terms of educational research. Some of the things that happened, for example, was a phenomenal increase in the number of Black children who were labeled special ed, because quality education did not include cultural competency in terms of what it meant to teach, what it meant to engage in a culturally diverse environment. The other kinds of consequences of that was that power was never desegregated. And so decisions around curriculum, decisions around discipline, decisions around curriculum were such that it was very hard, with the exception of Foster, to create a supportive environment for children and teachers, to create learning and teaching environments that affirm the full humanity of everyone who was there. And so where we are right now, fast forward, I spent last year raising questions within the faith community about the moral agency of the faith community to address McGraw-Hill, who published a textbook in which African Americans were introduced as being brought here as immigrants to work in the field of agriculture. This is year 2015. It's that kind of myth-making that I think, to Doria's point, third Reconstruction, we're at a historical moment. We've got to penetrate that myth-making, have the courage to tell the truth, to go through the pain that is necessary to confront that truth on our journey towards democracy. And unless we do that, we are only going to be playing musical chairs. Once again, I'm spending an inordinate amount of my time dealing with voter protection and the right to vote and voter engagement in 2016. Issues we thought we had resolved 60 years ago. I have much more to say, but I have to stop there and end this.
Thank you, Dr. Carruthers. Okay, now I'm going to introduce Dr. Neighbors again and really have him focus on what inspired him to write this, what I'm calling letter from an Evanston jail.
Doria, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here. Grateful for seeing so many members of Second Baptist Church who are here. It's good to see familiar faces. And I'm happy to have my 12-year-old son, who just finished his 6th grade at Nichols, who is here with me as well. I met Doria a few months ago. We were in New York, and we were at the UN with Dr. Carruthers, and I thought that I'd found a really fast friend. She's brilliant, she's able, she's capable. And then at this panel discussion, she decides that she's going to introduce me after Dr. Carruthers. It just doesn't make any kind of sense in the world. I am not an academician, and I'm in the midst of academicians. I am here as a pastor, and with a background in ministry almost totally from the time that I was in graduate school. So I appreciate your putting everything into brilliant context with your analysis, not only on Evanston, but on education as it has affected the races in the United States. And I want to say that a part of my being prompted to write the letter to address the concerns that came out in the Academic Achievement Gap Report by District 65 were really rooted in my own kind of experience, both as a student growing up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and going all the way through graduate school. On the very first day of junior high, when I was 11 years old in the 7th grade, it was also the first day of desegregation in the United States in 1971. So on the first day, we arrived at South Junior High School on the south side of Kalamazoo, and that school had never had more than a handful of black students, and all of a sudden they had about 30%. There was no indication that things would go bad, but from the very first moment we walked into the school, there was fighting, and there was really what we would call a race riot. And that was my introduction to junior high school. Junior high school is tough enough. Do you all know that? You're just dealing with your hormones. You're struggling to try to find a friend, you know, in junior high. But there we were tremendously divided. And then I want to also share that the unique experience of Evanston, and I think it really is unique, is not totally individual. There are other pockets around the nation that have a similar experience. For instance, Princeton, New Jersey was very similar to Evanston with regard to their desegregation and their integration process. There was one black school that was in town for students from K through 8th grade that was called the Witherspoon School. From there, they all went went to the high school. But you know, the same thing happened when the change occurred, as it did here 50 years ago. It occurred in Princeton a little earlier. I think they were the first place in the nation to engage in desegregation in 1949. But what happened was, and I think that Dr. Carruthers hit on this, is that something ended up missing. Everybody was really celebrating the transition from desegregation to integration, that now we can finally live together, go to school together, become friends together. And what folks didn't really recognize is the absolute amazing, powerful infrastructure that existed in the black schools. There was an infrastructure like you wouldn't believe. There were principals and administrators and teachers and custodians who were not distant from the lives of the children that attended the schools. I'm sure it wasn't any different here at Foster School. You lived with the principals. They were right down the street from you. You lived with your teachers because they were right across the street from you. So you saw professionalism. You saw people that absolutely cared about you. And it's important for you to know that when integration occurred, most of that changed. It's critical to know that when the black schools closed and the black children were shipped to white schools, that didn't mean that all of the black faculty of those schools were automatically hired into the white schools. You know what it meant? Most of them lost their jobs. It didn't mean that the principals were shifted from the black school to the white school. They lost their jobs. The custodians lost their jobs. And everything that the students were able to identify with academically in terms of relationships, in terms of looking at people who looked like them, who lived across the street from them, most of that was lost. And so I come to Evanston a little over a year ago, and you know, I'm pretty excited. You know, I've heard about Evanston. Evanston is a place that's filled with tremendous diversity. There's a great appreciation and respect for people from different backgrounds and ethnicities and races. You know, I did my homework. You know, just like the church vetted me, I vetted Evanston. I did. And I came away with this positive feeling and positive sense that this is going to be a great place. And for the most part, I will tell you that I have experienced very, very positive things in Evanston. But it's very important for you to also know that I've experienced some challenges, especially with my children who were in District 65. My daughter started at Dewey. She was going into the first grade, and my wife and I decided that we had to take her out of Dewey after 30 days. We took her out of Dewey after just 30 days because we felt that there were all sorts of complications and issues, not related to the teacher, not necessarily related to race, but related to this precocious child who was beyond her years in intelligence, and she's going into a classroom where she had to absolutely learn like all of the other 28 children in the classroom. So we had some problems with that, and we put in another school. And our son, Pierce, at Nichols in 6th grade, started very excited as you can be going into middle school, losing all of your friends in one community, and saying to your dad and mom, now why do we have to go to Evanston? What is the real reason why we're going? Dad, can't you find another church around the corner from where we are? You know, all sorts of things came up. But we were able to get him through that year. We were able to get him adjusted with some complications and issues at Nichols to a new environment. What I learned was that there is discrepancy. What I learned is that there are significant issues. And when Superintendent Gorn released the report, I said to myself, Eureka! I had a eureka moment. You know, a light bulb went on. And I said to myself, everything that I have been feeling about my children, all of the concerns that I had been feeling about my children became realized in the report. And Dr. Carruthers talked about it being transparent, and also Doria, it was a transparent report. It talks about the significant issues between black children and white children. One of them is that only 10% of black children in District 65 are defined as college ready. 10%. Can you understand what that means from the focus of an African American pastor, from a parent? Only 10% of the 100% of children who are in our schools, children of color, are going to be college ready. There are all sorts of other discrepancies. You all read the report. The math achievement report is that 80% of our white children are at the readiness level that they're supposed to be at from kindergarten all the way through the 8th grade. But when it comes to African American children, that number goes down to 15%. With regard to language arts and reading, the number is 79%. When it comes to children of color, it goes down to 20%. There's an issue. And even District 65 has said that there is an issue. I appreciate that. The critical question is, what is the answer? So I've learned by listening to a lot of folks in Evanston, black and white, that diversity alone is not something that we can just celebrate. We can't celebrate because here we are, a town that's filled with diversity. Diversity has to always be intricately interwoven into equity. If we're going to have diversity, we must have equity at every single juncture. Don't just celebrate because we have all kinds of races and all kinds of ethnic groups that are in our community. Celebrate that we have all kinds of races, all kinds of ethnic groups that have the equal opportunity to excel in every single area, be it education, be it housing, be it employment, on and on. And so I think that's why I'm here. I'm here because I believe it's important. It was important for me as a pastor to stand up and say we've got to do something about this report. I'm very glad that you released it, but hey, releasing it is not enough. How can we create a mechanism to address these issues? And I think a part of that mechanism, believe it or not, is that here we are celebrating 50 years right here at the old Foster School. I'm so excited about it, I don't know what to do. I've never been at Family Focus, so I've never been in Foster School. So I feel like I'm walking in a museum, you know? It's just incredible, talking to folks, seeing the pictures when they were just little babies, you know, kindergartners. It's exciting to be able to see that. But at the same time, we are here for business. We are here to make sure that we can provide every opportunity for every single child, white and black, in Evanston, so that they don't grow up saying, I don't have any way to get to college, but so that every one of them can say, who wants to, I'm going to college, I'm going to make a difference in this world, and I'm going to leave a lasting mark on society. So that's why I'm here, and that's a pastor's perspective. Can I get an amen?
Take this time to welcome. You know, I wrote part of my dissertation in this building, and I was honored every day and thought that my mother went to school here, my grandmother went to school here, my grandfather went to school here. What did it mean that the archives were in this building? And so I want to welcome you to sacred ground. We were only welcome in this area, and so we built it and we took care of it, made it a beautiful place. So,
Amen.
yeah. Thank you. And I want to now pass the mic to Mr. Ruff, who everybody faces lighten up, brighten up whenever you say Mr. Ruff is in the house. I want him to speak about, you know, what it's like to go to foster school and then become an administrator and then look us in the face and have our backs all those years. If you could talk about that trajectory and sort of what you see as an educational consultant happening in the current conditions in Evanston.
Thank you, Dr. D, as I affectionately call Dr. Johnson, who's soon to be realizing her doctorate degree. Dr. Crothers and Pastor Neighbors profiled the information very, very clearly and gave so many points that I don't need to really talk about that, but I want to just talk about having come to Evanston as a youngster and coming through foster school. I remember some teachers who were here who had certain demands upon me. And these demands were such that no matter what I felt I wanted to do, they would not allow me to do anything other than doing my best. And that was something that got me started in terms of a future. My mother had a 8th grade education, and my father was a 10th grade education, but one thing my parents did was made sure that I stayed at the table to study at night. My teachers here communicated with my mother, ensuring the fact that I was going to get an education and wanted to make sure that I did what was necessary. So I gave that little bit of a profile to just let you know that it's important that you have teachers such as those that we had here at Foster School. These were teachers who were compassionate, teachers who were committed, teachers who would communicate with parents, teachers who would come by your home. These were teachers who had so much love for the children that they would not allow you to do wrong. And if you did wrong, you paid the price. And there are many. Mr. Hill, I remember sometimes I used to think my head was a cushion. He thumped it so much. And you know, there were just many of the things that we did that were not very good things as youngsters, but we learned the values of what life was about through the teachers who circulated throughout this building. So as a result, I found that there was some value in life, because it would have been very easy for me to go down the wrong road and to not feel that education was very valuable, because I didn't have that from my home. You know, that wasn't the kind of values that you would typically think coming from a single parent home. My mother and father were not together, but the lack of education that was formerly in the family structure did not give me the impetus to go and get an education. But my mother said, you're not going to get past the school system without getting an education. I may not have gotten it, but you are going to get it. Teachers re-echoed that. So teachers did not allow me to waste my time, did not allow me to abuse my educational opportunities. And that's what we want to ensure that we get from teachers. Now, I hear many teachers talk about having fun in education, and that should be a part of education. However, having fun is teaching such that when students do well, that's where the fun comes in. Just allowing children to do what they want to do because you want them to enjoy education or enjoy school, that's not fun, because then the children don't benefit from it. So having demands, having expectations, ensuring the fact that students are getting that, that's what education is about. And I think that's what everybody up here is saying. We want to get to that point where all students, when it comes to equity, are receiving the kind of quality education that they deserve. That's students who may not have but a single parent, may not be able to read well, may not be able to do the other subjects well, but the teachers are not going to allow them to get by with being secondary to a quality education. They have to have a primary effort towards getting the best that they can get. And that's what the teachers were about here at Foster School. So as I got that education, that impetus for an education, I went on through the high school and just feeling that I was prepared. I was prepared because teachers cared for me. If I did something wrong, teachers called my home. They made sure that I did not continue to do that was inappropriate. So I learned those behaviors for myself. When I went to college, I decided I wanted to be a teacher. My initial thought I wanted to be a mortician. I don't know why I wanted to be a mortician. And the teachers,
they make good money.
Yeah. and I think because of the teachers here, that was what redirected my thinking to become an educator. And I went to college, and I was one of 3 male students in school who became elementary teachers. And one of the things that I feel is so important, and Dr. Moody can tell you, we didn't have a lot of male teachers as we came through. There were some here at Foster, but beyond Foster, there weren't that many African-American male teachers that we encountered. And that's important. We had good teachers, and we had some male teachers, but having some good African-American or black male teachers That's important, because those of us who didn't have a father in the household, we could identify with that. We had some, uncles and aunts, uncles rather, or other relatives that we could say, well, these were surrogate parents, and they would help us. But there's nothing like having somebody that you can look at and say that that's a person you can depend upon. That's a person who can give you the mentoring necessary for you to become the kind of person that you want to be. So having black male teachers in your schools, having them around you, that gives you sometimes the support that you need to become a little bit more successful. I want to say that as I moved on and became an administrator in District 65, I tried to emulate some of the things I learned from Foster, but also I learned some other things that no matter what, I said to the African American students who came through my tutelage or under the supervision of myself, high expectations, no exceptions, no excuses was my motto. And that's what I felt that I tried to engender for the students that I had much encounters with. I look in the audience, I'm sitting next to one, but I look in the audience, I see 4 or 5 other former students, and it makes you feel good to see that they succeeded with you having had some input into their lives. But you have to have had the opportunity to have gone through Foster, to have gotten the experience so that you could relate to some of the things that I feel that I went through because of the things that teachers provided here. And that's basically it. But I just think that I want to say one last thing, that there are a lot of things that we need to do to bring about some changes for trying to improve the gaps that are for our African American students, for our black students, in reading and math particularly. We can complain, we can blame, we can place shame, but the shame is if we don't do better. And we must start now. That's where the shame is. That's where the blame should be on where we're at now. What are we going to do to make a difference? Because we know what we've not done. We know where we're at. What are we going to do to make a difference now? And that's what I'd like to see us all focus towards that. And I think that's what we're here for now. We're not trying to blame anybody. We're not here saying that we're ashamed of what has occurred, but we have to make some differences in helping all students receive the valued education that they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. I appreciate your comments. Last but certainly not least is Dr. G-Lo Logan. He will speak to, I hope, sort of what it's like to be a village son and a homie, right? But not only that, G-Lo has a critical race analysis that I think is really important to bring in at this time, and has also been a diversity consultant to some of the institutions here in Evanston. So if you could combine all that, do your thing.
Okay, thank you. Can you all hear? Yeah. Okay, wonderful. I was trying to figure out what was I going to say after all that's been said, right? You all laid a serious groundwork before me, but it's my honor to be here. And Dory, thank you for the invitation. I respect the work that you do tremendously. And this is a good example of and we have a number of examples here. People who are from Evanston, who may not currently reside here physically, but that spirit is always here. And this is a manifestation of that. So just thank you so much for the work that you've done and for helping to organize this along with everyone else. Myself, I'll speak from a non-academic lens, since we've had some of that represented here on the panel. But my first conscious living memory on planet Earth because I'm the baby of the bunch, in case you all couldn't tell. I know Mr. Ruff looks good for his age, he might confuse us, but I'm the baby of the bunch, so I'm going to speak from that perspective. But my first conscious living memory on planet Earth was I was sitting in the back den of our home on McDaniel Avenue, and I remember those little black and white TVs where the screen was about so big, the TV was about this big. And I remember I was 2 years old. I was sitting on a chair in the corner. All I remember is the television, the table in the room, and my mother, and then her getting a phone call. And I remember her scream and her hollers upon receiving the news of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it was her reaction that was my first conscious living memory on planet Earth. So that was my introduction into the world, into diversity and social justice in a sense. I was born here in the 5th Ward at Community Hospital. How many people were born in Community Hospital here? Okay, so I'm not alone. Dr. Hill delivered myself, my brother, my sister, my mother, and my father here at Community Hospital. From there, who was a woman, by the way, Dr. Hill. I then attended Miss Marshall's nursery school on Lake Street in Fowler. And I mention that because it is very significant. It wasn't until 25, 30 years later that I really began to appreciate what that experience did for me. I was actually in the South Island of New Zealand. I was about 27 years old. And there they call them kaupapa. These are cultural schools that they have for their youth. And in their schools, they are not allowed to speak English. So it's a regeneration of their culture, of their cultural identity and heritage, and of the language. So myself as a visitor, they pardoned me for not being able to speak their language and allowed the children to speak English in the school. And as I observed that day and did a little bit of service, it was amazing to me to see what the cultural groundedness did for those children. And it was being in the South Island of New Zealand that gave me the basis upon which I reflected on my experience all the way overseas here in Evanston at Miss Marshall's nursery school. And that gave me what I just call cultural grounding. I was culturally grounded in my own culture as a youth. Then I attended Washington Elementary School. So, very diverse, pretty well integrated at that time. But I had a cultural foundation that I brought to that experience. Then I attended Chute Middle School, and up until that time, I only had female teachers. Most of them were white, but a lot of them were great teachers that I still remember today that tremendously impacted my life. Then I went to Chute Middle School, and now I have a principal who's a black man, Mr. Payton. I had 2 assistant principals who were black men, Mr. Phillips and none other than Mr. Ruff. He insists I call him Oliver and he calls me Dr. Logan. No, Mr. Ruff. But again, I reflected on that experience and the power of that. My math teacher was a black male. I had 2 science teachers who were black males, Mr. Ellis, Mr. Rochelle, Mr. Carter, QT Carter, Miss Green, Miss Willis, Gwen Petard. I had so many teachers that reflected who I saw myself, who I was beginning to see myself to be. And there's a scholar, Scipio Coleman, who came out with the concept of self-ethnic reflectors. And I see that people like Mr. Ruff and all of those teachers were self-ethnic reflectors. They were people of my ethnic background that reflected a positive image of what I could become. So that gave me, I can look back and see that gave me hope. It helped to create a vision for myself. And not only were they black, but they were great teachers, because it's not enough just to have black teachers in the school. I know a lot of bad black teachers. Okay, so it's not just that. You can be of any race and be a great teacher. I then went on to Evanston Township High School, played basketball, played football. So I grew up with a middle-class family. And it wasn't until I left Evanston that I really began to see the realities of what it means to be black in America. And that's the experience that many Evanstonians have after we leave this, in a sense, illusion of what Evanston is. There's many people in our community who refer to the diversity in Evanston as drive-by diversity. Now, I didn't coin that term, but that's a term that's, I think, very appropriate in many respects. And growing up in Evanston as an African American, thinking that this is how the world is, it's a rude awakening leaving Evanston and seeing that it is not. And if I did not have some cultural foundation to fall upon, I would have fallen down and out. And I still struggled, even though I had that. I still struggled, even though I had both parents at home. I struggled. So I went to SIU in Carbondale, and I was on the 5-year plan. So, 5.5, you count the summer school. But I struggled, and I went to college thinking, you know what, I'll major in administration of justice because my father was a police officer at the time. So it was a very lazy decision. He's a cop, fine, I'll be a cop. Until I took the courses, they were so boring, I couldn't stay awake. So I said, how can I do this for a career? So you know what, I'm gonna do business finance. Why? I want to get paid. I want to make money. I want prestige and status in the eyes of my community. And until I almost flunked my way out of school struggling with finance, I then began to look at myself and say, wait a minute, I'm doing all these for the wrong reasons. Not for my father, not for the prestige and status, but who am I? And that's the question that I had to grapple with. And I was living under this veil in Evanston of who I was that was broken and shattered once I left the boundaries of Evanston. So now I'm grappling with that question, who am I as a man, as an American, and as an African American male? And it was through a lot of the racism that I experienced in college. I didn't graduate on time. My final semester, my thesis paper was on apartheid. And I was in business marketing, mind you, and I chose apartheid as my topic because I saw it, and I was the only African American in all of my classes. But I saw how our government in public spoke against the apartheid regime, but yet we were the main supporters of it from an economical standpoint. So I was exposing that in my paper and in my presentations, and my professor took issue with that. So long story short, he accused me of plagiarizing my paper and felt I was not intelligent enough to produce the work that I did. And because I didn't have the cultural competencies to understand that, you know what, let me go to the chairman of the department. Let me go to the dean or the provost. That was foreign language to me. I had no idea what to do. So I struggled through college. I ended up graduating with a 2.0 grade point average, just barely enough, because I just did enough just to get by. And at that point, I still had questions about life that I needed to figure out. And I look back in Evanston and I realized how privileged I was growing up in Evanston. And Evanston, we're a very privileged community. And yes, black folks in Evanston, we're privileged too, a lot of us. But I saw my own privileges. And I realized that, and I also felt the pressure to make something more of myself. So to try to figure myself out, I came home, I worked, I saved some money, packed a backpack to go traveling for 2 weeks. 2 weeks turned into 16 months. And I went into the South Pacific, which was the first place, and I'm getting off of the plane and seeing black people in that part of the world where I didn't know they existed then. Because again, I'm coming out of college from business marketing. But it was stepping out into the world that gave me a different image of what it means to be a black man, not just in Evanston, not just in America, but in the world. I saw myself as part of the global society, and I saw I had a seat at the table. So as I traveled and experienced these different cultures, and I was very blessed to have been able to do that, I came home to my own community and saw a lot of what was missing. I saw the beauty and the benefits, but I saw a lot of what was missing. So I felt compelled to try to bring to my community something that we were missing. And I started Soul Creations as a result of that, a nonprofit organization using West African drumming and dance to teach life skills, creative expression, and cultural fluency. So it was a holistic approach to identity development for not only black children, but all children. 16 years in existence. We had an office here in Family Focus for a number of years, and I was stunned to find out that my office was where my grandfather's gym class was, speaking of the history that's in this building. So I really felt the connection to this building and to the community. Ran Soul Creations, and after 4 years of doing that, I ended up traveling again. I left the country for 3.5 years, came back, continued the work of Soul Creations. But as I look at our community now, you know, I went on to get my master's in elementary education. So I went from a 2.0 grade point average to a 3.8. My parents are looking at me like, wait, who did you cheat from? The fact that at that point I had a sense of who I was. It was strictly about identity, nothing else. And I then went into elementary education. I did my student teaching at CHUT. I was the building sub for the district here. I was the building sub at Haven for a year. Once I got my degree and applied, I was denied on numerous occasions here in Evanston. And I'll speak about one case in particular, not naming no names, but there was a principal or assistant principal at the time, a black woman, who refused to hire me because of my hair. Now, little did she know I had family in the district and one that worked at the building, so I got hold of this information. So it's not just a thought, but there were actual words spoken that it was because of my hair. So I was never hired as a certified teacher here in Evanston, so I taught in Chicago. I taught elementary and middle school in Chicago. Most recently at Armstrong School of International Studies, which is on West Estes near Toowood. Taught there a school of over 1,000 students. I was the only black male teaching other than the PE teacher. And what I became in that building, I wanted to become for my own community. And I wasn't able to do that for whatever reason, because I was not employed here in the district. So I taught middle school, and eventually I taught evening school special education at Evanston Township High School. So I've been through the system here as a student and as a teacher, and when I look at the state of education today, and when I look at the statistics of our children, it's appalling. I'm enraged, I'm embarrassed, but I have to look at myself and say, but what am I doing about it? And there's a lot that needs to be done. We're all responsible to some capacity, but I constantly look at myself and say, what am I doing about that? I feel compelled as a member of this community because I realize the opportunities that I have is a reflection of the community that I come from. So in other words, there's the French philosopher Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. Well, the African-centered notion of that self concept is I am because we are. And because we are, therefore I am. And that's how I look at my community, that's how I look at the state of our schools. And when I see how children are performing in many other schools around the world, you know, tracking is very uniquely American. How we track our students as young as elementary school, that's very problematic. That's not happening all over the world. But you find it very prevalent here in the United States. Special education, if you look at Finland as an example, one of the top educational systems in the world, and they have more of their students who are in special education than we do here in America. Now explain that. The one point I want to mention in saying that is that in Finland, special education is not looked down upon. It's looked as a form of equity in the sense of giving students what they need in order to succeed. And it comes from a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. In other words, because a child's in special education in 3rd grade does not mean that they're dumb or stupid or on track to fail, but they have needs that need to be addressed, and the school allocates resources to address those needs. And when those needs are addressed, they move on to other levels of educational attainment. But in Finland, they see it as temporary to be in special education. Whereas in America, we have this notion that's like a fixed identity. Like that's who you are, and that's who you become. And that's very problematic within itself as well today. So I'll just close it out by saying that I think that as privileged and as powerful as we are here in Evanston, we need to leverage that privilege and power to do the additional work that needs to be done. And in doing that work, I just think it's essential that we all look in the mirror at ourselves first before we point the finger at everyone else to say what they and what you all need to be doing, and ask ourselves individually from a cultural standpoint, from a racial standpoint, from a gendered standpoint, what is it that I can do to help contribute to making this change, because we are at a very crucial juncture in our history in the country, but also in this city. And we can institute to deal with the systemic oppression that is within our institutions. As Dr. Carruthers talked about, it's not so much the individual racism and sexism and homophobia and et cetera, it's how it's institutionalized in our policies, in our hiring practices, who gets promoted, on what standards, and et cetera. And it's at that level that we can use our power and our privilege to help bring change here in Evanston. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Gave us a lot to chew on, right? I could go on and on about this. But I do want to close with this one anecdote before we open it up to public questions and answers, and let you know that I lived right down the street at 1928 Foster Street. And years ago, I was at the fish keg in the middle of the night, like a lot of us. And I ran into one of my neighbors, Tim Cox, who actually lived at, I'm not sure of his address, but I was on Foster and Brown, and Tim lived closer to Dodge, right? And we were talking about sort of these innovative things that happen at Foster School, King Lab School. And Tim looked at me at one point and said, I want to know how is it that I live closer to the school, but you and your brothers got to go. Right? So at that point, I was able to quantify what my community missed by taking the choice of bringing all these assets and resources into this school, along with white kids, as opposed to making a decision to distribute all those assets across the district, so that all of my neighbors would have benefited. So I want to close the panel by having us really contemplate and think about, you know, the parts of Evanston that paid the price for all of the things that we're joyful about right now. And when we celebrate this, and just be mindful that some people did pay a price for that.
Amen. Amen. Just a quick comment on that note. I currently, I was raised in the 2nd Ward. I live in the 5th Ward for the last 17 years. And my wife and I, years ago, were co-chairs for C4BE, Citizens for a Better Evanston. And we were trying to get a school built here in the 5th Ward. So that was the push behind that. And when we talk about the cost, I remember when I first moved on Hoveland Court, I lived next door to my grandfather. And he used to say that integration was the worst thing that happened to black people. And at that time, I don't know, I was, 29, thought I knew it all. Like, what are you talking about? Like, that's what we were fighting for, that's what we died for, that's what we wanted. Not understanding, as Dr. Carruthers touched on, that is not what we were not asking for. Mr. Brown, when we talk about Brown versus Board of Education, Mr. Brown was not asking for the schools to be integrated. Okay, see, I didn't realize that as a youth growing up. But I understand that now, and I see the cost, to your point, of what integration has done to our community. So not to say that it's all bad, that's not the discussion. I'm just simply saying the cost in the black community, particularly in the 5th Ward, and through integration we lost, not as strictly as a result of, but within that context, we lost Community Hospital. We lost the Emerson Street YMCA. We lost Foster Schools. We lost over 20-something businesses on Church and Dodge alone. So we lost a lot of our institutions, our cultural identity. It's not just having black people reside in the homes as much as it is having a black consciousness and awareness from a cultural standpoint. And we lost a lot of that through integration. So currently today in the 5th Ward, I can wake up on any school morning and see how many dozens of school buses picking up the kids to still integrate. We have an integration model based on 1967, folks, in Evanston, 2016. And I see it every day when I look out of my living room. And when I refuse to put my children on that bus, and I either drive them or walk them to school. Now, again, there's a privilege with that. Not everyone can do that. See, not everyone can afford to do that. But again, I just wanted to touch on briefly just one of the costs of integration on our community, from my grandfather's perspective, and also for my experience as well, having kids who are growing up here in Evanston.
So, what I would like to have us think about for a moment is that integration was a paradigm really for racial management. It was not a paradigm for educational equity as it was intended to be. And I think what we have to do is to reimagine what educational equity looks like despite where you are. So if we look at Evanston as a suburb, I think one of the things we have to do is to break through this myth about Evanston. People of color who migrated to Evanston as a part of the domestic class, as higher income whites were leaving the central city of Chicago and moving further and further north. And therefore, North Suburbia became a model emblematic of your socioeconomic status. And so the black class that began here was a part of the domestic class that moved with high-income whites. There were two other kinds of suburbs. There were suburbs which were founded by black people with intentionality to create self-sustaining communities. But then there was a third type of suburb, and I lived in that third type as well when my first husband died, and that was a suburb which was founded by intentionality as an experiment, such as Park Forest. Those were communities which were birthed out of a racial management paradigm which said, open up the suburbs. There were actual scholarly studies that took the North Shore and identified what percentage of black people, black families, each suburb had to take in order to create an effective policy of racial management. So I say that to say that if you ask the wrong questions but you have the answers to them, it will not get you where you want to go. As my grandmother said, it's better not to know the answer to the right questions. And so I'm suggesting that should we be for or against integration is not the question. The real question is how do we get into the stadium where we really can honestly talk about educational equity. And that begins with truth. The foundation of Evanston, i.e. named after Evans, who was one of the major conspirators and celebrants of the Sandy Creek massacre of Native Americans, has to be understood. We also have to understand that founders of the womanist movement, not the feminist movement, Mrs. Willard was at odds with Ida B. Wells over the question of saying that black men were being attracted to white women, and that was the curse that was causing for the rapes, i.e. therefore the lynchings. That kind of understanding about the historical foundations of America, community by community, is a necessary stage of sacred memory to get us to reparatory justice. And I'm suggesting that that's part of what we have to do in sessions like this, which is why this becomes so important.
Again, we have a lot of intellectual firepower up here, and Evanston is an interesting place to study. So having said that, we will open the floor now for question and answer.
Can we just have a statement or a comment? I'm nervous, but I'm not a good speaker.
First of all, I'd like to thank everybody on the panel, and I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I grew up in Evanston too. I started at Foster with my teachers, Mrs. Mims, Ms. Fisher, and as he pointed out, it was important to have the teachers that lived in your area. Ms. Fisher lived right around the corner. That was important. And Mr. Moody was one of the best teachers I've ever had. And to have had black males as your teacher was very important in those days because I didn't have a father. And he was my surrogate father. Then I went to Skiles where I ran into Mr. Ruff. And one of the incidents that happened at Skiles is we were watching a Martin Luther King movie, and where they were dragging us out and putting the dogs on us and the holes in the waters.
And we were in the assembly, and I don't want to be white against black, but there was a white girl that was reading a book while this movie was going on. And so me being angry, you know, because this is what I'm seeing, attack on my people, I snatched the book and I said, oh, you're gonna watch this. And so Mr. Ruff, he kindly took me into his office and he didn't criticize me or he didn't chastise me, he helped me. And he said, I'm there for you. And he said, I understand what you're going through. So that's when he became my next father. I've had him grow up down the street on Homeland Court, another big brother who's active, very active in our community right now.
Just loud.
Just loud, but it doesn't matter. My sister right there, I grew up with her, and just everybody. Just so many names, you know, I could go on and on and on and on. And it's so important for us to have had this meeting, you know. But it upsets me to know that I've been lied to, or there's been a lot of untruths. Because I was just as rambunctious as you were. You know, I was a fighter, and Mr. Moody, he knows, you know. And I'm thinking back now, during those times, I got a scholarship to go to an all-white school. And what? Was I experimenting then too? You understand what I'm saying? North Shore Country Day, which is a very prominent white school. And I don't know. Maybe because I was smart, or maybe they just wanted to see if I could do better in a different environment. And that makes me think, you know. It makes me do some real deep thinking. But I'm here because I'm showing you what our community can do for a person. I've accomplished a whole lot. And I felt in my heart that in my life, because they have done so much for me, that I need to pay it forward. So the way I have paid it forward, I have two foster children that are still with me. I've had them since they were 14 and 16, and one is HIV positive. So in my lifetime, I've had to, you know.
You guys need a loud I'm a little old now, I'm 60, and I'm the byproduct of the same generational identity. There was a community that raised me that I can't even explain to you how strong it really was. And it's even past schools, it's past teachers. You know, when I was telling Carlos, when I threw trash on Carlos's house on Darrell, not only did he pop me upside the head, but he also called my grandfather, who came home and popped me again. Not that it saved me from going through nothing, but I want to ask a question to all the intellectual power. Instead of, you know, this is a wonderful moment, everybody graduating from Foster, I'm really happy for that, but this town's in a bit of trouble at the moment. And I want to ask, what do you think can replace or repair that African American community that was, you know, once the leader in home ownership throughout the nation? Even our income has gone down. Everything about us has changed, and you know, it raised all the people up here. Reverend Neighbors probably was raised in the same type of process in Michigan. I just want to know, how do we repair it? So that's my question.
Well, I think that's the $1,000,000 question. So thank you for starting this off with such an easy task. It's a critical question. I think that the answer to it, of course, is not. There's no single answer for how to repair the breach that has been created in African American communities like Evanston. You can talk about Chicago, you can talk about Detroit, you can talk about Princeton. There are so many amazing nuances and issues and problems that are often germane to that particular geographical location. So I do think that the first issue is getting everybody to the table to discuss the reality that there is a problem. And I think that's the first issue. I think that in places around the nation, there is this sense that we are Americans. I don't know if you all understand that there seems to be a new movement very similar to the old movement that was love it or leave it. Mm-hmm. That if you don't like it, stop complaining, you know, and that sort of thing. So I think that we have to gather the right people together in the African American communities to sit down at the table and to say, what is our situation and what are we confronted with? here in Evanston is going to be different than in some other areas. And that's not going to be easy. See, because I've only been here a year, but it seems to me that we are not necessarily all on the same page. We are dealing with different issues and different crises. And I had a wonderful, wonderful African-American psychologist who shared in a workshop at the church a couple of months ago, everybody wondering why folks are under stress, right? Why are we under duress? Well, Dr. Perkins suggested that part of the reality of stress for the African-American community happens not to do with anything that you're confronted with, but the very fact that you're born black. If you're born black, you're born into a world that is going to create a certain amount of stress for you. You don't have to do anything, you don't have to say anything, it's just the reality of your existential state. And so with all of that in mind, we have to sit down at the table. That includes business people, it includes residences, it includes churches, it includes educators, it includes folks from Northwestern, it includes folk who are down on Church and Dodge, and we have to say, what is the issue? There are a number of issues. You're talking about housing inequity. You're talking about education inequity. You're talking about employment inequity. You're talking about issues where certain places may be getting constructed where minority contractors don't necessarily have an opportunity to put in a bid to receive an opportunity for them to be successful. I'm sure you know about that. So we got to get together and discuss all of those issues, and then somehow, as difficult as it is, we have to come out of that discussion with a singular voice and a singular agenda. And I think that is the way that we can begin to address the issues that are facing us. Everybody has to come around the table, and then we have to agree that there has to be a single agenda that goes out. And the person that's going to be the spokesperson can't be the person that ends up going into the back room and receiving a little bit of shade and getting a little bit of money, that goes into their own personal coffers. You can't have that person being the one who's going to be the spokesperson. The spokesperson has to be free from, one of the things, I know I'm way off, but one of the realities is, one of the things I loved about the black church a long, long time ago. Amen. One of the things I loved about the black church a long, long time ago is that for the most part, the African American church had pastors and clergy persons whose sole revenue and resources came out of the context of that particular church. So your salary, your housing, the way that you're caring for your family was coming from your own people. What that created was a certain freedom. It created a certain independence for you to be able to get up and call a situation out and say, this is wrong. And nobody was able to come and say, well, we're going to interfere with your salary. Or if you keep saying that, we're going to fire you. If you keep saying that, you're going to, we're not going to allow you to do this or that. And now, you see, I think most of that has changed. And most of us who are in the black church now and pastors, we, may have 2 or 3 salaries that are coming in. So we're not just working for the church, but you may be working for the university. Well, if you're working for the university and the university has an issue that is an equity issue or a race issue, you may not be able to say the same thing that you said you could say if you weren't working for the university. So I know somebody's an NAACP person a long ways from here, so I'm not going to mention the person or anything like that. But we were having a real difficulty in a small town a long, long ways away. We kept going to the NAACP. Why aren't you speaking out about what's going on with this particular organization in the community? They're not treating African Americans right, and it's proven. He said, well, I can't do anything about that. And of course, Freedom Fund banquet came around one year, and that particular organization gave the NAACP $50,000 for their Freedom Fund banquet. Lord have mercy, it's no wonder the brother didn't say anything. If he's going to say something, then that might have denied a $50,000 contribution to the NAACP. So the issue is we've got to come together and we've got to find the right people who are not afraid to speak, but at the same time are not privy to somehow being bought off because of the issues that we face being stressed in this world that we live in.
Amen.
To add to that, to to just remind us that America is really at a point in its history and in its sense of identity where our very soul is at stake. And so this is really a question for all of America. And I think to engage in this kind of discourse towards the end of creating a reparatory justice plan is very important. I've been doing a lot of reading lately on lessons learned from the Holocaust. And the notion of what happens to a nation incrementally in terms of stages of becoming evil, to the point that individuals who have no sense of what's going on become complicit in the very evil that is being perpetrated. America is at that point, and we have to understand the extent to which our very soul is being penetrated by the reality in which we live. I think we need to begin to think about what it means to create a Marshall Plan. We can go to Iraq and go from ground zero and recreate community. I think we have to understand that we've got to take those same principles, those same assumptions about humanity, and apply them to American communities. Not just African American communities, but I mean all American communities who need to do an asset map and a liability map of what's at stake here in terms of where we are. We cannot live without the rest of the world. And so taking America back is a myth, only on a path of self-destruction. The very air we breathe is a function of what's happening right now in the Amazon forest.
I wonder if Rucker Johnson is here.
He is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I could get a little bit of sort of your analysis whenever you get an opportunity.
Come over here. No, you come. You be next.
I'm taking it all in.
No, you come. You be next. So I don't want to glorify Evanston, but I wanted to just think back a little bit to the integration moment, and remember that there was a precursor to the movement for integrating Evanston's schools, and that was actually taking over the Democratic Party in Evanston, and in fact founding the Democratic Party of Evanston. So Evanston was really a Republican town in the 50s, and people on the left took over the Democratic Party and founded a branch of the Democratic Party independently of Daley's machine. That was a precursor to the integration thing, experiment, whatever. Alongside the integration movement for integration was the movement for open housing, and the open housing ordinance was passed in either 67, 68, somewhere in there. It obviously didn't work, but that fight was a parallel fight with integration. There was also the expansion, professionalization, and relocation of the child care center. These fights were all going on. It wasn't just us. It wasn't just the lab school. People were fighting on a bunch of different fronts in order precisely to translate into a challenge to the structures of oppression. And that all got stopped then. I hope we're at a different moment. I hope we're at a moment in Evanston and elsewhere where there's even more Black leadership to take on this fight, and where I think that the white majority in this town, when I was very young, I'm not going to say when I was growing up, because by the time we were electing at MICFA, I think this was a different town, but I hope now they're not so resistant, because that was a lot of what crushed this 50 years ago. You can't be a minority pushing it against a power structure. But maybe people of justice are a majority now, and they can be organized. I don't know. I don't know if this is a better moment. But almost everything that we've said in this panel is heartbreaking and enraging, because I feel like we are back in the 30s, which is an era that I did not live through, obviously. But that is pretty heartbreaking and enraging, yeah. That was a comment.
Thank you, Lisa.
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
I'm glad to be here. Edie Rabinowitz brought me. I'm actually a transplant to Evanston. And so I told Edie I was coming here today to try to understand Evanston better. Because I did my master's in sociocultural studies and educational thought. And I feel I'm living what you all are speaking, but it feels even more stressful and vulnerable because I have 2 small children. And so everything that you all are talking about happening, it feels like now I have to, I don't want to give my children to the system. But it's also very stressful to figure out what to do then to educate my children alternatively. And so I recently, after the events that have been happening nationwide, have felt an immense amount of fear and terror and sadness and anger. And a certain amount of hopelessness too. Because when I moved here, I didn't know Evanston well, so we moved to Northwest Evanston. And I don't know if you've ever heard how loud silence is, but it's loud. To walk out of my house the day after someone was murdered, died on live, on social media, and have someone just say hello. When I felt like it was a national tragedy, all the women of color that I'm connected with on social media, we were terrified. We were saying, how are we gonna get up and do tomorrow? How are we gonna do it? And I walk out and my neighbors are just having a good day. Or when I say I'm grieving, they say, oh yeah. Like they've almost forgotten a little bit about what happened when I can't forget it because it lives in my body and then I have to worry about my children. So I love the ideas about what we do, but I think that Black folks, we have been resisting, we have been fighting all of our lives, and we will continue. That's not in question. The question is, how do we get folks who have power to tap into their power and privilege to dismantle the system that's allowing them to be comfortable and us to feel terrified? So my question continues to be, and some people have heard me ask this question before, of Evanston is, where do we go to get people to not only have us resisting, but for them to dismantle the power systems that are allowing them to feel safe, comfortable, and at ease, and pity our sorrow and fear and anger, but not necessarily do anything to dismantle what's causing it.
Amen.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jamila Pitts, and I serve currently in Evanston School District 65. And I'm so excited that I happened to see an email that helped me know that this was happening today. Because I support, one of the programs that I support in Evanston is the African-Centered Curriculum Program. And I asked myself how this experience relates to fostering that program. 10 years ago, there was a study, there was the same uproar that we've had about students of color not achieving in the ways that we want them to achieve, and some people working very hard instituted the African-Centered Curriculum Program. And I can't go through all of the history of what happened to it then, but in last year, I was asked to support it. So when you say, because I asked the same question that you do, like, what's my responsibility? And one of the biggest challenges that I think we have is trying to meet the needs that were being met in what was known as a segregated school in an integrated community. So we're having this African-Centered program, and some people look at it as segregation. And I had to explain to someone that when you choose to be in community, that's different than being segregated. And then the second piece is to work with teachers when we're trying to figure out what are the instructional practices that are going to be more holistic. Because Peter Murrell argues in his book, African-Centered Pedagogy, that some of the things that are required or expected in schools are actually damaging to the instruction or the educational development of young children, black and brown children. So one of the questions I wonder is, what kinds of preparation programs or what kinds of studying do we need to undertake as educators to better prepare ourselves to meet the unique needs of black and brown children, much like bilingual educators go through a very special certification program. If you're a special educator, you go through a very special program. But we now know that black and brown children have special needs, but how are we preparing ourselves for that? So if you give us some insights, that would be great.
Yeah, Dr. Carruthers, I don't know if you'll be able to. One answer to that, I think, is that one answer, can you hear me now? Hello?
No, it's on.
Now it's on? No, it's on. Okay, now it's on. Yeah. So one answer, I think, is we need a holistic curriculum on being human. Because part of what happens, I think, is that there are assumptions made about a tiered system of humanity that then gets inculcated in the spirits and the pedagogies of teachers that allows them to treat some children differently than others based on how they look or how they have been labeled. The reality is that all children need an individual education plan. And that individual education plan begins with affirming one's basic identity. And that identity is related to culture and ethnicity. And so all children need to be affirmed in all environments. African-centeredness is a construct that merely says this is a pedagogy to affirm the African identity and experiences that people of African descent have had. It is no different than what we have in many states, which is mandated curriculum and instruction around the Holocaust, which ought to be no different than our opportunity to teach children of different ethnic, religious persuasions and traditions how it relates to living in community. So I would begin with human rights curriculum. I would begin with understanding what it means for a declaration of human rights. And then how does that get played out in the construct of Ubuntu in a classroom? And whether that classroom is homogeneous or heterogeneous will dictate what the content of that pedagogy is. But the pedagogy has to be with the end goal of embracing the fullness of the humanity of all children. Period. Dot. Simple. But we, with our sole injury of a country that was founded on the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement and economic enrichment that grew out of a transatlantic slave trade, have got to face that reality if we're ever going to create the kinds of classrooms that you're talking about.
I think another side to that coin is we need an institution in this neighborhood again. And, begging for it as opposed to demanding it are two different things. Evanston has been part of, black Evanstonians have been part of the economic floor since the early 20th century. Black people own their homes at the same rate as whites in Evanston. So I was appalled when I came back here a few years ago to work on the notion of rebuilding a foster school in the 5th Ward, how people who were opposed to it were interchanging three things: poor, low reading skill, and black. And I kept thinking, I knew I'm in graduate school, right? And I'm listening keenly. But you just said three different things, maybe about the same person, which are three different people. And so when we were denied the 5th Ward school, it wasn't 2 weeks later that I drove down Sheridan Road and saw construction apparatus at an all-white school over there close to the lake. The money that could have gone into rebuilding our school was distributed to white Evanston. And I just stopped my car, was in tears. I'm tired of begging for things that we've already earned. So thinking about, like Reverend Neighbor said, being on the same page and understanding that it's not about integration, it's about having a choice. And that if realtors sell houses in Evanston based upon, different things for different groups, so you're going to sell it as a diverse place with a walk-in school in your neighborhood, a house in a black neighborhood is not going to be sold the same way. You're selling a bus, right? And that we need to understand that there are differences and the distinctions, and that having an institution here that can be open till 8 o'clock at night with a library in it, is something that we've already earned, and we shouldn't have to beg for that.
Very simply, I just want to say, to piggyback on Dr. Crothers, we not only need to embrace a pedagogy, we need to ensure administratively, teachers and community, that it is being enforced, or it's being implemented in the classroom setting, in the community. Because so often we can verbalize something, but we don't do anything to actualize it. And I think that that's what we need to do, is to ensure the fact that we are seeing to it that these things that we talk about are being realized. And that so often stops at communication. It doesn't get beyond that. We as Dr. D just stated, we not only need to expect that, we need to demand that.
I concur with what's been said. I think in terms of like teacher preparation, I think about what I went through. Again, a typical teacher today is going through doing their student teaching, which could last as short as a few months. But again, you look at like Finland, you look at South Korea, high-performing nations, and it's a year-long process. And I think on a different note, in a sense, the dehumanization of people in our culture is what we're seeing in our schools is just symptomatic of what's happening in our society in terms of, and how not just people of color are objectified and dehumanized, but just people as a whole in our society, and this national discourse and dialogue, how to dehumanize one is part of the norm. And that's very problematic. And I just think that how are our teachers inundated with that type of, or exposed to that, but yet charged with cultivating the humanity of children. And I would ask that how can we cultivate that humanity in someone else if we ourselves are lacking that very same humanity, particularly if we're unaware of it. But I think teacher training is essential in terms of how are we cultivating those cultural competencies in teachers, regardless of their race.
Hello, my name is Sheila Mary. I am director of Evanston Cradle to Career, which is an initiative that was developed directly to recognize that there is profound inequity in our community for our young people, and that we have a responsibility to change that, and that it's going to take our entire community to really change that. So I would first like to ask anyone who is interested, we would love to have you involved in helping us to figure out what that means. But we are a collaboration of, we have the superintendents of both school districts, the head of the Department of Health, the head of Parks and Recreation, Northwestern University, and many of the EDs of our nonprofit organizations coming together to say, we have got to create an equitable community. And my question to you is that I worry that we point all the fingers at the schools, and I don't think it's just the schools that are failing our community. And I would love to hear your thoughts about how do we create a community-wide effort that embraces all of our kids and says, we are committed to having every single one of our kids be successful. And I think that's going to take every single blasted one of us, not just the teachers in District 65 or 202. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I concur. It's not just on the schools. It's going to take a community-wide effort at the very least. I personally feel that, I do a lot of work with parents in my consultancy, and I think that that's just one key element of many. But I just think about I don't know how many of you all, I don't know about you all, but like myself as a parent now, I never received a manual as to how to parent my kids. Did you all? Maybe I missed that. Maybe I'm just the only one. But think about how many generations people have been parents. We're talking about millennium upon millennium. Yet how many of us, what's the manual? What are the keys and the to-dos and the don'ts and in terms of how we deal with a lot of these challenges and issues? So I'm saying that to say that I think that parental education is a key component. When we had the notion of having a school here in the 5th Ward, I always envisioned classes for parents in the evening, because the school being a cultural center, not a school for the kids to go to, but it's a cultural center for everyone in the community. So it's the community school in that sense. But I think parents, just to say it's true, I think parents ourselves, we need to open ourselves up to being educated as to how to better educate our parents. So it's not to indict parents as a whole, because we're all doing the best we can with what we have. But I believe we can do better. And I think too often, particularly communities of color, we too often rely upon our schools to educate our children. And I think that's a mistake. Myself as a parent and as an educator, I see myself as the primary educator, first and foremost, and the school as secondary. They're complementing what we're trying to do in the home. And when that's not in alignment, then it's my job as a parent to call attention to that and deal with it accordingly. So I think that too often we rely on our children, on our schools to educate our kids. And as black children and black parents, and many times what ends up happening is our children are then miseducated by the system. And so Carter G. Woodson wrote the book, Miseducation of the Negro. But really, that could be miseducation of America, because it's not only back then Negroes or African Americans. We've all been miseducated in terms of who we are as people, our accomplishments, our cultural identities and backgrounds, and our contribution to this society. So I think there's a miseducation as a whole within our institutions that are helping to perpetuate a lot of these problems. But again, just to go back to your question, I think parent education is key in addition to what's happening in the schools.
As Dr. Logan stated, parent education is key. Other institutions within the community have to communicate, as you've already begun. But I think one of the things that we have to do individually is to talk with one another, get each other out of our comfort zones, because so often we have next door neighbors. We're afraid to engage in conversation that we may differ on certain opinions. So once we start having individual conversations about different things that are going to improve society, improve education, improve life, then I think we can start moving out beyond that immediate circle. And I think that it's important that we've got to do that, and then we've got to learn to start trusting one another, start having a vision where we're all on the same wavelength. And I think that's not there because I don't trust you, you don't trust me, so we're not going to go beyond that. As we talked earlier about the thought of the business aspect somebody mentioned, and we worry about somebody taking the money because the person is not being often trusted. Some kind of way we've got to start engaging each other in conversations that are legitimate, genuine, and authentic. And until we do that, and until we can move beyond the disrespectfulness and the racist kind of thinking that we sometimes find ourselves engaged in, we're not going to ever get to the point of growth. You know, we're going to stay in that stagnated point. And we've just got to move and have more conversation on a global manner where we get beyond our comfort level. And I think that's a big start.
I have two responses. Just 3 days ago, I chair a charter school in Chicago, in one of the poorest communities, impoverished communities in Chicago. And we had to confront the reality in the context of the significant cuts that are coming to Chicago public schools, that we have on paper that we probably have about a 12% homeless population, but the reality is it could be 30%. So can you imagine creating an effective instructional program for children who are homeless, whose parents are trying to function and pretend that they are not homeless? And so the first thing I think we have to do is really be realistic about who we're serving, and indeed who we're holding accountable then for the success of those we are serving. And I think the lessons that are emerging out of the philanthropic community, which they acknowledge that they have created an environment of competitiveness between service organizations, that we need to move to models that are driven by what's called collective impact. In other words, where we come together and instead of competing with each other over IVA as the student who has different needs from different agencies, rather us sharing our resources so that we can create the greatest possible paradigm of success to support IVA's success. And until we move to that model where we share collectively as a community, then we're going to always reinvent these models of failure. So I would suggest that you call and convene all of the stakeholders and have an honest conversation about how do we work together to share our resources towards the end that we're all trying to get to.
I just wanted to share that this is a collective impact in effort. In fact, each of our partners has paid in to be a part of this initiative. So it's our organizations coming together and working using the collective impact model. So we're going to be tracking our impact, and that's very much the intention.
I guess this is my reunion too, because I went to foster school as well as my parents and one of my grandparents. So this is a reunion that I see as, and I've also visited Dr. Carruthers' school, went to school with your mother. But I see when spring came around, everyone was excited about who was going to get the highest score at the time we were. I'm now working with the after-school program. The kids don't care. If I tried to get them to do something, the teacher doesn't care. So when I went to my high school reunion, and some of the students came and said, "I'm sorry, we didn't know. I don't know how many are still here, but I'm sorry, we didn't know that you were going through this. We didn't." And there are people who just don't know. Maybe they don't care or don't care to know. But it's sad. I'm working with kids after school, and they are not as enthused as I was, as my students. It was said that there were 10% who were college ready. When I graduated, there were probably 10% who were not college ready, and that was 3 generations ago. Because my daughter and my grandchildren also are products of Evanston schools, which are not what it was when I went to school. And to speak also about the divide and conquer, that's what happened. That's what happened here. We were getting too strong, and so it was decided. I looked at that movie, and the person who said that they thought that it would be better to have integration was not a person who looked like me, who did not have a student in this school. And they said that it was a good idea to do that. We were not a ghetto, we were a community. And when this integration, I guess it's integration, came, we lost our community. And we've lost a community that maybe stayed longer than some of the communities in the United States, and so that we feel the brunt of it now more than before. We have lost people in higher positions who could help, who were interested, I don't know, it goes beyond just parents in school here. It's the economics, the housing, it's everything that's all combined. And Evanston is just Cosmo. It's just a little bit of what we can see at a higher level. We've lost our homes, we've lost our schools, we've lost our community, we have even lost our children. And there are people here who probably don't even know that this was a community, a very strong community. We had our homes, our doctors, our lawyers, we lived all over Evanston, not just on this west side, but when we did live on the west side, we made a strong community. It's gone now. And I don't know what's going to happen. I'm afraid of what I see, because this generation now, the children, I'm not talking about the teenagers, I'm talking about the children, are not interested. They can't be interested because their parents have their nose to the grind just to provide housing and food. Thank you.
I have a very unique position in this community. I think I was the only one that went through this school from kindergarten through 6th grade who had a relative that was on the faculty. And one thing I learned very early from my aunt was compassion and success education oversees any other skill that you'll ever acquire in education. And yes, as I look at Mrs. Johnson, who was a member of the PTA, and I think about the strong PTA we had. I remember my mother coming to the PTA meeting and all the black women deciding what we needed for our schools. And we worked together through the churches and the communities to make sure. We had an orchestra at the school, we had drama, we had art, and I don't want it to be mistaken, from the previous video it said that this was an all-black school. Now let's get that clear. There were only three black teachers at Foster School. Okay, and from kindergarten to I graduated in high school, I only had 3 black teachers in 12 years of education and 1 black male. The same experience is almost scary. That when all of us did what we were supposed to do, prepared ourselves, graduated from college, and came home to return or pay back or pay forward to our community, we weren't even hired. I thank God for Ed Pate, who pulled me in from the Chicago Public Schools and gave me that opportunity. And then we started looking at what we can do as individuals. And for the young lady that lives on the north or west of Evanston, my heart is troubled because what I'm hearing you talk about, my grandmother experienced in 1929. At least they don't pick your house up on a truck and move it from Willard School to the 5th Ward, okay? They moved my grandmother's house physically out of North Evanston. There was a street called Bower Place with 5 black families. The Logan was one of them, the Suttons and the Thompsons. These were individually owned. There was no welfare then, okay? And they decided when they were building the Presbyterian home on Grant Street that no wealthy white people wanted to be in close proximity with black people, no matter how upwardly mobile they were. And that's when they landlocked us into what is now referred to as the 5th Ward. But the hope is some things work then and they still work now. Home ownership is the key. We as black people had more land under Reconstruction. I'm just looking at my own family. Between my 2 grandfathers, we had 300 acres of land in America. Now in my generation, we have 3 lots. Okay, so to go from 300 acres of land to 3 lots in 3 generations is very frightening. But you can own your home, you can plant a tree, and teach your children to honor God and themselves, and they can prevail over any other things that this community can throw at you. So when we talk about equity, there are certain responsibilities we're going to have to take for our own community to end the black-on-black crime, to be responsible. And I thank Robin Tucker, when I think of what her husband did with the Universal Builders there on the south side of Chicago, when all of those people were evicted and he stood up and made sure that those people had the right, after paying all those loans and leases for 10 years, the right to purchase their home before they were all evicted. So there are resources here in this community that we probably don't have anywhere else. So I'm not talking to the black community, I'm talking to you white folks, okay? So I wish that you now would start in your country clubs and in your churches and in the organizations that make a difference, that you should study history yourself. The Russian Revolution did not come from without. The peasants rose up and overthrew the aristocracy. The French Revolution did not start by being invaded by Africans. Poor people raised up and overthrew the aristocracy. So it seems to me every major power in this world, even Rome, was not destroyed from without, from within. So we have a cancer in this community that we need to eradicate. And it can only be eradicated through compassion and working together and consistency. And I can't thank you enough for your work with Trinity and the community, and to see, I know what works. And Brother Logan, there was a manual for raising children. It was called Dr. Spock. And my grandmother thought it was the best thing when my uncle and aunt raised their daughter. She found Dr. Spock was better used to whipping her behind than me. So there were certain things that we have to go back to. Family, consistency, jobs, home ownership, having pride not only in ourselves but in our community. And Evanston, if you can't work here, it's pretty sad to say that we've had over 200 years of experience in this country, but yet we've had 100 experience of our presence here in this community, and we shouldn't be having the same discussions that that young lady had 100 years later that we went through. So it's time to stop this and turn this community around, and let's work together rather than see it fail and be successful for everyone.
Carlos Sutton taught me that these are moral, ethical questions, right? That will take a moral, ethical answer that's not written down on paper. It's not going to be easily justified, doesn't need to be, when it's a moral and ethical question. And I also reminded when Dr. Murphy, the previous superintendent, said, every weekday we send our kids in to fight our social justice battles. And where are we as adults in that process? I think we're out of time. And so I want to thank the panelists for opening up